Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us here in the Waterstones virtual event space tonight. I'm Samantha Shannon, and I'm the author of the Bone Season series and The Priory of the Orange Tree. I'm also very proud to announce I've had a haircut for the first time since July, so I'm finally camera ready again. I hope you're all settled in with something nice to drink, because I think this is going to be an amazing conversation. It's my first time, I think, hosting a double event, and I'm so glad that my first one is with two brilliant authors whose imaginations are as rich as their storytelling. Tonight we are celebrating the launch of Realmbreaker, the start of a brand new epic fantasy trilogy by New York Times bestselling author and screenwriter Victoria Aviard. She was born in Massachusetts and has a BFA in writing for film and television from the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts. Her debut was Red Queen, which was published in 2015, and the series has gone on to sell in the multi-millions. She currently lives in Los Angeles. I'm also thrilled to be in conversation with Kester Grant, who is the Sunday Times bestselling author of The Court of Miracles, a young adult reimagining of Les Mis and The Jungle Book, as well as the upcoming Golden Paw. Kester was born in London and grew up in the UK and the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Mauritius. The Court of Miracles was her debut novel, the first in the trilogy, and it's now out in paperback. Please feel free to drop questions for our authors in the Q&A box below. And without further ado, please welcome to the stage Victoria Aveyard and Kester Grant. How are you both this evening?
Hi, that was an amazing introduction. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I could know that the line about your degree was very long, like I had to catch my breath for a second.
I'm always surprised as to which bio someone's going to use or which one's been sent. So at this point.
How are you today, Kester?
Oh, she's muted.
So professional, everyone. Hi.
Everyone take a drink.
I wish there was one, but there wasn't time to prepare. I live in Mauritius, so it is very late right now. So I'm just like keeping my eyes open like this. But I'm so excited to be. Sorry, I'm so excited to be speaking to both of you. This is the first time I've met both of you, because I am such a big fan. I don't think you understand. So this is so exciting for me.
Well, I am such.
We're all Samantha Shannon fans here. I think the whole participant group, we're all ready for this one.
Oh, bless your soul. Thank you so much. Well, I'm such a fan of both of you, and I've had such a wonderful time being wrapped up in both of your worlds for the last couple of weeks. So I thought I'd start off by asking if you could both tell us a little bit about these books and what led you to writing them. So Kester, could you start us off with telling us what the seed of The Court of Miracles was?
The seed of The Court of Miracles was my lifelong frustration with the Eponine, Marius, and Cosette love triangle. Every time I watched any version of Les Mis, it was like, oh, it's so beautiful, it's so wonderful, it's so moving. Why do I hate Marius Pontmercy so much? And then one day it just hit. I always used to say I'd rewrite Les Mis and I'd call it Les Contents, the happy, you know. And then one day I thought, well, hold on a minute, you kind of sort of could. Not that Court of Miracles is all happy clappy. But I just saw this amalgamation of a different way to tell the story, which would be centered on Eponine instead, and give the women in the story a lot more agency than they had, and just make something fresh out of something which I loved. And yes, that was it.
Brilliant. I will come back to the feminist angle a bit later, because I absolutely love that, and I'm also a massive Marius hater. Victoria, what was the seed behind Realmbreaker? What started this journey for you?
I was coming off of the Red Queen series, which I'd had a lot of great success and support with. So I had a little bit of pressure, but also a little bit of an opportunity that a lot of writers don't have, and that I knew I could take a really big swing and kind of go where the wind was blowing me. And I thought, well, what do I want to write? Like, what is the thing I want to do next? And what did I really want to read when I was 14 years old? What was the thing that I was missing? And I think that's what a lot of writers do, is we're always trying to fill the gap that we're personally missing. We're writing these things for ourselves first. And of course, I grew up a very maladjusted, like nerdy teenager, and I loved Lord of the Rings probably more than I loved anything ever or ever will again. But it was very much a story that didn't love me back and didn't feel like it had room for me to kind of go on the adventure and be part of the fellowship. And if you're not a straight white guy, you really aren't allowed to be one of the heroes for the most part. So that was what I took going into Realmbreaker, is I want to write that classic fantasy adventure, but I want to make it a little bit more expansive and make a little bit more space for people who haven't necessarily seen themselves. And luckily, that's something that a lot of people are doing now. And there are a lot of teenagers who don't have to feel the way I did and don't have to feel like they can't go on the adventure or be part of it. And when I went into Realmbreaker, I knew I wanted to sort of take a Guardians of the Galaxy meets Lord of the Rings situation and look at what happens when the classic heroes fail and sort of the B team of saving the world is called up, and they're not heroes, they're misfits and criminals and a teenage girl. And I had a lot of fun throwing all of those characters together.
You can really tell that you were having fun while writing it, I think. And weirdly, I had a similar experience with, when I saw Arwen in the Lord of the Rings films, it was such a formative experience for me. But then when I went to read the book, she doesn't do the whole cool thing with the Nazgul. I know it's so heartbreaking. It destroyed my little heart when I was about 10.
I had the exact same experience. And I remember, because I hadn't read the books until I saw the first movie. And I believe we're around the same age. I was 11 years old when I saw that. And the thing that made me really want to go was that part of the trailer where she pulls out Hada Hafang and takes on the Nazgul. And I was like, I want to see her. And that was it.
Exactly. And I will, like I said, I will come back to the women thing later, because I'm fascinated by how you both examined gender in your books. But I would like to talk about history first, because both of you draw from history in writing these books. And I was wondering how exactly you went about doing that, what you decided to carry over, and what was your own invention. So Kester, with the Court of Miracles, could you tell us a bit about the real Court of Miracles and the balance between history versus your imagination in this book? Like, how faithful did you feel you had to be to actual historical France versus your sprawling criminal underworld?
Well, apparently not faithful enough, because there's this one thing that all the reviewers, even on like a live interview, they came and they said Fabergé eggs were not invented at that time. And I'm like, okay, it's fine, it's a made up fantasy world. And they're like, yeah, but is it really?
Oh man, it's so annoying.
just anyway, so historically the Le Cours de Miracle, which means the Court of Miracles, was an urban legend at the time in Paris. People were worried that the criminals were gathering in these kind of like little underworld enclaves. And they were called the Court of Miracles because they said that beggars were pretending to be lame and blind to be getting more alms. And then they would all gather at night in this basically like a mafia, but in those days the mafias didn't exist. And there, all of the lame could suddenly walk and the blind could suddenly see. Therefore, it was a court of miracles. And there was in Hugo's book, Notre Dame de Paris, which I don't know in English if you call it the Hunchback of Notre Dame, but anyway,
generally,
Notre Dame de Paris actually has a court of miracles in it. And Hugo, he invented that. He invented that there was a sort of a king and there were all these criminals, but it wasn't real. And I was inspired by that, and I mashed it with Les Miserables, and I was like, okay, this would be really, really awesome if it actually existed and was a thing. So it wasn't kind of ever sitting down and thinking, how can I create things? It was more looking at what's already there. And the thing just kind of, it just grows organically. It's like a monster. You're like, oh, that would be cool. And then suddenly you've got like a 7-book series plan in your mind and you haven't even started it. So that's and one of the other threads that was quite interesting was that there was also this urban legend that the rich were poisoning the poor by putting poison in the city's wells, because at this time the only water you could get were from these fountains that were all around the city. And this was a huge thing. And so the poor were refusing to drink. And of course, it was actually some disease that was going around. And I stole that and I threw it in the book as well as a major element. So I always say, like, you don't really have to make much up. If you read history, you're just like, no one would believe this if I actually wrote it down. They'll think I just made it all up.
Yeah, I was wondering about that, because obviously I have written about the Court of Miracles myself, so I knew about that, but then I didn't know. It was interesting about the poisoning, because I was like, has she based that on a real thing? I hadn't heard of that before, so that was really interesting. Victoria, you said that Realmbreaker draws on the Mediterranean sphere between the 12th and 13th centuries, if I think I'm right about that. Could you talk about your research and how you integrated that historical influence into a high fantasy world?
Yeah, I wonder if research is the correct word, because the original inspiration for where I was going to set it, or what my parameters at least would be for this brand new second world, was from a medieval war game that I play.
Oh.
Which is set during the Crusades, and you can play as pretty much any kingdom, any nationality, any religion, any government structure in between the years 900 and 1400. And it's very, very intense and very detailed and really, really exceptional. It's basically about as close to Game of Thrones as you can get in a video game. But we'll talk about
Amazing.
that at another date. But that was very much the jumping off point, and also the idea that a lot of classic fantasy set in Western Europe has always been very, very white, which is very incorrect for historically the way that the world worked and the amount of sort of cross-pollination that there was between different continents along trade routes. You know, anyone who immediately says, oh, there was a Black person in London, this movie is incorrect. Not true. So I wanted to open that up a little bit more and build a fantasy world that felt more real because it felt more diverse. I feel like everything I do is in service of making the audience believe. And that's one of the best things you can do, is make this world feel like it's populated by real people, and real people are all different and come from all different walks of life and races and backgrounds and orientations. And those were what is most reflective of actual history. In terms of building the actual world, I do start with the map. I'm very much a map person. And I got really, really lucky with this book and the artist who eventually created or elevated what I had into what's in the beginning of Realmbreaker. I'm stunned, constantly stunned by looking at that map. And I think similar to what Kester was saying, it's about building the layers. It's about having one thing that leads to the next thing that leads to the next thing, because that's how our actual history works, is things trigger each other. So when you're looking at even the base level geography for a world, that triggers other things. You know, where a mountain range is going to inform how a religion spreads, or how a technology spreads, or where the borders are in a kingdom. So I know a lot of people will do the map after the fact, but for me, it doesn't make any sense to do something like that. I have to start at the seed and really let it grow organically. And I had a lot of fun with that. I had a lot of fun with poking at the different ways that a Mediterranean-like world would exist, and the way that different kingdoms would interact with each other. And I very much did the whole, like, there was an ancient empire, there was a version of Rome. We do see these old ancient roads, and that's very, very the old Roman roads. And I loved getting to put those little things in, because that's a little bit more common known, but there are still people who are like, oh, that's a cool thing. And it's like, no, that's real. I just changed the name. It doesn't say Rome anymore. It says Old Core, and we'll go along with that.
Yeah, when you mentioned the aqueducts, I was like, I feel like she might have taken some Roman inspiration here. That actually slides really nicely into my next question, because I was going to ask you both, what is your favorite little detail about your world? Just something that's quite small, because obviously we do a lot of grand world building, but I was just wondering if you had one thing that you were really proud of or thought was really cool.
Please don't ask me first.
Sorry, I need to remember.
Ask her.
Okay, Victoria, you go first.
So there's the Kingdom of Galland is essentially similar to the Holy Roman Empire. And at one point there's a sick character, and a character says, oh, we'll bring the doctor to see you. And she's like, I don't want to see him, thinking he's a doctor from that empire. And he's like, don't worry, he's university trained in the South. He's a real doctor. He's not one of the stupid bloodletters up here. And it was very much like during the Middle Ages, the Christian world was really backwards, and they really did not understand what was going on, and people were still struggling to figure out how to bathe, versus the Muslim world, which was founding universities and inventing algebra and having clean water piped through their cities. So I loved having that little, like, there are different levels of advancement in this world, and that's just another thing that makes it feel like our world, because that's how it works.
What about you, Kester?
I've had time to think, so
good.
I think a lot of people don't know, but Court of Miracles is actually a complete reimagining of the Mowgli stories in the Jungle Book, and almost every character, it has an equivalent Jungle Book character. People's eyes start to glaze over, because I like to then go one by one and explain which animal they want.
Oh no, please do. I'm fascinated.
So I'll do that later. But yeah, no, so for me, I love the Jungle Book so much in that I love the lore of the rules and the regulations, the hierarchy, and the way that the different animals interact with each other and how they live their lives and what they're allowed to do and not, like what the peace rock is and what it means and all of these things. And I stole all of them and threw them into Court of Miracles and just changed them into like a human setting. And that is my favorite element of the whole court, and in fact of the books in general. And I suppose, I mean, you guys are, I mean, you're like masters of fantasy, but like, you know what I mean? When you read and watch things, you're subconsciously or consciously, you're picking up the same things that you love in all of these different, you know, so that's something I've always loved, is these, I don't know even how you'd explain it, but that's what interests me, that kind of that background politics. And it's all got, you can't just come in and do whatever you want. Everything has to go according to this pattern and these laws that everyone live by. It's kind of like that political intrigue that's going on behind the scenes, and you can't just come in and topple it, because if you want to play the game, you've got to play by the rules. And that's just my favorite. I even just literally took, which is a bit sad because I'm an author and I should do better, but it was the last thing I did and I didn't have time. They're like, what are the laws of the Miracle Court? So I just took the poem from the Jungle Book, like, this is the law of the jungle, and I changed a few words and I put it in the book. And I've had people be like, that's so beautiful.
You're like, that's
I didn't really write that. Yeah.
That's amazing. I loved kind of doing a Jungle Book spot when I was reading it, because I'd read somewhere that it was also a Jungle Book retelling. So I was like, oh, the tiger, it's Shere Khan. That was exciting.
Hold on, there's another Jungle Book retelling out there, because I need to read it immediately.
No, I just read that yours was also a Jungle Book retelling. So I think because it was like kind of advertised as like the Court of Miracles as a Les Mis retelling, because obviously Eponine is the main character, but then I spotted somewhere that it was like Les Mis meets the Jungle Book. So I went in with that knowledge, which was helpful.
I'm fascinated by the moment where you decided it's not just Les Mis, it's also the Jungle Book, which to a normal person, if you were to say I'm writing Les Mis meets the Jungle Book, they would be like, what does that even look like? But somehow you managed to synthesize it.
Well, no. Okay, so that's literally what I did though, because I walked out of the cinema we just gone to, you know, Disney did with Scarlett Johansson doing the voice of Car. So I walked out of that version of Jungle Book, and I was saying to myself, you know what, it's so weird how vulnerable Mowgli in a dangerous jungle that has all of these rules is really similar to Oliver Twist in a criminal underworld that has all of these rules, which is really similar to Cosette getting adopted getting thrown into Thénardier's world. And Thénardier in the book, it's not in the musical, but he is part of this little criminal organization. And I was like, this is the same story, you know? And that's when they all went, and I could see Eponine on the rooftop and all the rest of it. So when I wrote it, and when we first sent it to my agent, because that's how I got my agent, was with this book. And I sent it into this competition called Pitch Wars. So I told everyone, because I'm thinking, to get your first book deal, you've got to have something so big that even if people aren't, this is going to be amazing, even if you can just make them go, what the heck is that?
They want to read it.
It means they're interested, right? So I was like, Jungle Book meets Les Mis. Every single person who read that was like, what does this mean? Yeah. And they came back to me and they said, I started this book, I didn't know if there was going to be like wolves and Cosette and Valjean in the wild. But you know, so it worked, the trick worked, but they decided it was too confusing for the general populace to market it as such. So they stopped talking about Jungle Book in it at all.
Well, you played the game well. Speaking of playing the game and playing by the rules, you knew what you were doing there.
It was a long shot, but it worked out for the best.
In fact, once again, that perfectly leads me on to my next point. I love when that happens. Both of your characters are, of course, involved in sprawling criminal enterprises of some description. And Victoria, I was fascinated by you making Coraine a pirate's daughter who deals with taxes and smuggling and that kind of thing. What drew you to that background for her?
Well, I was coming off of writing a series about literal superpowers and a lot of characters who are physically very, very strong. And I knew going into this one, I wanted to write a character whose superpower was maps. And so I could get my sort of map obsession into the pages and create a character who loves them the way I do, but also use them to her advantage. So it became that she's very intelligent, she's very logical, she's very good at connecting the dots and seeing not just A to B, but A to F. And getting to use that in a quest structure alongside characters who are physically very, very capable and still making her valuable was a really, I knew it was going to be a challenge, but it was a challenge I was going to really enjoy. So then it became natural to work back from, okay, I want her to be really good at this thing. What would enable that sort of environment, and what did she grow up in, and how can I make her still kind of sheltered but still very aware of the world? And it fell together that her mother is sort of this pirate queen who tells her daughter she's a smuggler, thinking her daughter won't figure it out. Come on. But that means, you know, she needs someone who's going to say, well, you stole this from this ship and this kingdom is willing to pay this, or this person is willing to pay this, so we're going to send it here, 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 and here's how we're going to hide it. And that became very cool. And I found that very interesting, because I think when we look back on the medieval world, we don't think of it as being very complex in terms of rules and regulations and taxation, but it was. So getting those little tidbits in, it also helps the world feel like a living, breathing thing. And it's just my trick. It's my way of letting the reader know there's more out there than just these people and just this story.
Absolutely. I really liked that she had that skill, and she does obviously learn to use a blade, but I enjoyed that she had that more cerebral skill as her kind of selling point.
I do love a training montage. I'm very happy to get them in.
You like a training montage and an action scene, which
Yes,
I love.
I
Kester, there are guilds in the Court of Miracles in your book, and I was just wondering which would be your guild, because Nina is part of the Thieves Guild, but which have you given thought to which one you might thrive in?
Yes, I get asked this question actually all the time, and it's hilarious because I think people are really like, well, she made this amazing criminal world, so she must want to be like an assassin. My editor, all of them, they're all like, Assassin's Guild, Assassin's Guild.
Really?
Let's be real. Yeah, no, all of them. They all want to murder people, which is worrying and illegal, but never mind, fine attached.
Worrying and
And illegal, yes, we must clarify.
Have you got, I mean, you must have seen that stupid meme. It's like, what's it say? Be whatever you want, unless what you want to be is a murderer. And I'm like, or do what you love, unless what you love is murder. I'm just like, yes, that's like the motto for. Anyway, what was the question?
It was which of the guilds do you think you would thrive in?
Oh yeah, no. I wouldn't survive 2 seconds in the Court of Miracles. I'm the weakest person on the face of the planet. I really like. Now, not allowed to drive down the road without a mask or whatever, depending where in the world you do, and I freak out. I'm like, no, you're gonna see me, I must put it on immediately. Like, it's just, I could never steal something because I'd be terrified of being caught. I'm the physically weakest person, like Gavroche, who's the small little orphan child who's a beggar, could probably beat me up. So the only guild I could survive in would be the Guild of Letters, because they have a lot of archivists and librarians. They also have spies, but I couldn't do that, although I'm pretty good at acting, but I'd spend my whole time just being in nervous terror that someone would catch me, and I couldn't. So I want to sit in the library with books, which is like the dream place to be, and that's where I would be. Guild of Letters.
I do wonder how anyone was ever caught doing it or tried for a crime before cameras. It seems so simple. How was any serial killer in the 1800s ever caught?
Yeah, it's quite, I suppose a lot of them who were caught probably didn't actually do it. So
yeah.
They just throw it at
or they were really not sneaky at all. They did it in broad daylight and then didn't have somewhere to run.
Yeah, that's a very frightening thought, isn't it? Just basically free reign over crime.
Yeah.
Now this is the question I love, because I love etymology. I'm fascinated by naming and how authors approach naming. Kester, I guess you were obviously using some names from Les Mis, but for the characters who were either of your own invention or just even the characters' nicknames and criminal names, how do you approach that? Do you just sort of feel like this is the right name for the character? Were you drawing from any particular languages? Obviously French would be one of them, but could you just talk about your process of naming characters, because I find it really interesting.
Well, aside from the ones that were pulled directly from the retells and the ones Hugo already had in existence, you see, where I'm British, but I'm also Mauritian. So I spent half my life in Mauritius. Is a very interesting place because it has there were no native Mauritians. We were colonized by the Dutch, by the French, by the English, and they brought in their slaves, some from Africa, but the majority were from India and China. And so our national language is English, but actually everyone speaks French. So we have all of these weird cultural influences. So I think when I came to the Court of Miracles, it would just suddenly be kind of like you're not really thinking, like a subconscious, someone would say a name, and I'd be like, oh, that's really good, like Artemon, oh, Artemon, I've got to keep that. Or Kais Sansal is the name of one of the lords of the court. I just heard Kais somewhere, and I was like, oh, that's like a miracle court name, you know. It was, I didn't plan it. And on the other hand, there are one or two characters, I believe, although I'm a bit blurry about it now, it was so long ago that I wrote it. Gayatri Kumaid, who is the lady of the Guild of Letters, she is named after my best friend when I was a teenager. His name was Gayatri. And Kumaid, have you guys ever read, this is like one of the best fantasy books I've ever read, and I'm going to forget it, City of Stairs. Have you guys read City of Stairs?
No.
No, you have, no, it's so under, my words, I'm a writer, but I have none.
Okay.
No one knows about it.
We know what you mean.
Nobody knows the book, you know. It's so good. It's by Robert Jackson Bennett Jackson, the main character. It is, I mean, it will blow it, you will love it so much, both of you. It's really, really up your street. And there's two main characters, and one of them is this little Indian woman, and she's got glasses, and she's not young, and she's not like cool and doing, but she is, it's so good. And her name is something Kumaid. So it was my little kind of homage to that. And then the other thing I'm obsessed with, which if you haven't seen, you really have to see, because your hearts will shatter into millions of pieces, is this Chinese wuxia series called Nirvana in Fire. Have you guys heard of Nirvana in Fire? It was like it's like the biggest Chinese series in the last, I don't know, like 50 years or whatever. It has millions of, obviously it has subtitles and all the rest of it, but the main character is called Mei Chang-su, and the lady he loves is called Ni Huang, so I stole her name because I love that series so much. But you have to watch it because it's like Game of Thrones. There's no sex, there's no magic, and yet it is more gripping. It is so good. Anyway, so it's like little things like that. I would just insert a little bit here and there, but otherwise, I don't know, it just kind of happened, I suppose.
I love that. Thank you so much for answering, because this is my fascination, like I said. And Victoria, how do you approach naming? Because with a high fantasy world, you pretty much have free reign. You know, you don't have to use real languages if you don't want to. I personally do. In my work, I work in kind of ancient and hypothesized languages. But what do you do about yours? Like, where would Coraine come from, for example?
Well, Coraine was specifically, I wanted to use the C-O-R, the core, because she is of the Corish bloodlines, and they all have C-O-R in their names. I kind of used influences for each of the different cultures from certain languages that corresponded with their geographic location. So the Yiddi are Norse equivalent, and they're very close to Viking culture. So I looked at letter combinations that would make sense to immediately let a reader know, oh, this is Norse, or this is a northern people. And again, I'm doing everything I can with the names to make it more accessible to the reader and to make the connection that much faster, where they know this person is from this place. And I can push them a little bit further because they already have some base level knowledge of where they're coming from, even though it's a completely different world. So I use letter combinations, and certain letters I wrote out for each of the major languages. These are the letters that they use the most. And then once I have that sort of primer, it's easier to make up place names and character names because I have a sort of bank that I'm drawing off of. And then once you get a little more fluency in the world, it's much easier for the reader to identify the character and where they're coming from. I also, if I were to like think about it, the old core is very Rome equivalent, so they're more Latin inspired names. Ciscaria was the country that exists where they used to exist, so it's moving further into Old Italian. Obviously Galland is Holy Roman Empire, so they're Old German. There's some German inspiration there. Tiriot is Greek, Ibal is Arabic, and then just pulling different pieces that make sense to me as to where that place would be. And then the elders themselves are completely different languages, but I used Scots Gaelic in particular for coming up with the name Democrion, but then knowing that's going to be the really tough name on the page, I leaned into using nicknames for him. So Dom is very, very easy, but then it leads to a much bigger name that a lot of characters have difficulty pronouncing or remembering. And that's another thing is with a high fantasy, you want to straddle that balance of making it feel like a different world, but also making it feel familiar enough to a reader that they aren't intimidated by the names, because there are so many things about a high fantasy that can be intimidating to a reader, and you don't want the names to be one of them. Similar to Game of Thrones, where they have, you know, Eddard Stark. Okay, Eddard is a weird name. Stark I get, and then his nickname is Ned. You
Right.
layer it in a way that the reader can still hold on to the things that you're giving them. You don't want to give them too many things to hold on to and then they drop it and they lose that thread of belief essentially.
Yeah, that did fascinate me because I remember once on Twitter I put up, like, you know, a lot of people say like the names in the Priory of the Orange Tree, you know, they either say that they do make sense or that they don't make any sense at all. And I was fascinated by that huge gulf. And I just asked people, like, what do you find too difficult in a fantasy name? And just seeing the range of answers was really, really interesting.
I steer away from apostrophes. I find that apostrophes are something that people immediately see and are like, nope.
Yeah, someone showed me like a Brandon Sanderson name once, and it was like this long. It was absolutely enormous, and it had like several apostrophes. But I think the character uses a nickname like the way Dom does to just.
Nicknames are a quick way around that, and you get
Exactly.
the angle of the name itself, but then you get the accessibility too.
Exactly. I'm going to move on to perspective now. So Kester, The Court of Miracles is written in first person from Nina's perspective. What drew you to first person? And did you ever consider telling the story from a different perspective or through a different character's eyes?
So I should probably mask this because I'm trying to look like a professional author person.
That's fine.
Basically, I had read so much about how difficult it is to sell a book, to even get a foot in the door. And I had read over and over again that first person was what was working for young adult. Now, this is when I was writing Court of Miracles, which is now, gosh, it came out like almost 5-6 years, you know, it was a long time ago now. Mm-hmm. And that first person was basically the only way to go, was like one of the things that was being said. I absolutely hate first person. I hated it. And I hated writing it. It was so hard. But I was like, I can do it. Hunger Games are one of my favorite books, you know, and it's so beautifully done in Hunger Games. You can't even feel it. It's just so natural. So I forced myself to do it, and I just did it. And you know what's the worst thing about first person is that, sorry to rant about the way I wrote my own book, but you can't talk about anything that's not happening in front of the character, or if they're unconscious, which is the worst when you have this complicated, it's just the worst. But anyway, I did it. And once I had finished writing it and we'd sold it, and it was being edited on like the second round of edits, so it wasn't early days when you could be like, I made a mistake. I read, oh gosh, I cannot even remember. Oh no, it wasn't even fancy. It was Pillars of the Earth, which I had never read before, believe it or not. I read the Pillars of the Earth and I put it down. Then obviously no comparison, clearly, but I put it down and I was like, Court of Miracles could have been like a lot better if I had written it from third and been able to, because the cast is so vast and what's going on is so vast, and the book could have had like a completely different feel, kind of like if I had, and I was like, what? And I phoned my agent in tears and I was like, Josh, please, can I rewrite it from scratch? It'll be longer and maybe it'll turn into an adult book, but, and he's like, no, it's great. And so he just talked me down, and that's how it is. But I will never, ever again write a series, anything in first person ever.
Yeah, it is. It can be very tough as someone who's written both a first and a third thing. I think generally I do prefer third. It is more my natural mode. But I actually thought it worked brilliantly for Court of Miracles, because it felt as if Eponine was just tearing her way through the city. I don't know, it was just really fun, like following her specific journey and the specific things she's trying to do. So just if it's any comfort, I thought it worked fantastically. Victoria. Yeah, no, it really does. Victoria, you decided to switch perspective from what you've previously written in, because you wrote Red Queen in first person. So why did you make the switch for this one?
Well, I did the same thing you did, Kester. I finished that first draft of Red Queen, and before I even signed with an agent, I thought this would be better in third person, and I almost restarted the whole thing, and thank God I didn't. But yeah, I agree. I much prefer third person. I think because we're all world builders, we all love getting into the world as much as we get into the characters. And in first person, obviously, you can go as deep as you want to go into a person's brain, but you can't go as deep as you want to go into their surroundings, and you're limited by what they know and what they understand. And going into Realmbreaker, I knew that wasn't something I could do. I could not do this book in first person, and I don't think it would suit the genre of high fantasy either to have it be in first person. I would essentially be hobbling the audience, and I think the world would be too difficult to understand or to grasp in the way I wanted them to experience it. And then the first 2.5 Red Queen books were written from only one point of view, and then I was able to expand them, and I really enjoyed doing that, and I loved getting into the other characters' heads and their perspective, and knowing that Realmbreaker was going to be a quest fantasy with sort of a found family group of misfits. I knew going in, I want to have different perspectives in this book, and not just YA perspectives as well. So have characters like Sarasa and Dom, who are adults. Dom's 500 years old, but his version of adult is different than our version of adult. But they're also going on very YA journeys themselves, where they're discovering, you know, what the world is in Dom's case, or in Sarasa's case, who she really is and who she thought she was versus who she's becoming. And those are very universal journeys for young adult stories. So even though they're not young adult characters, I found that it still fit within the genre that I was writing in. And I loved getting to have those moments where you're picking, well, all of these characters are in the scene together, but whose perspective is going to be the most interesting to the audience? Who is withholding something? Who knows what's going on? Whose eyes do I want to be in for this part? And that's a challenge, but it's a fun challenge. At the end of the day, it was more about making sure they all sounded different, which came quite easily. They're very, very different people, so that was a bit of a cheat. And then making sure
Sorry. I think that is easier in third as well, because I find that, I mean, I don't know how you found like multiple first person perspectives, but for me, I've always been terrified of doing more than one first person perspective, because I'm just so scared that the I voice would just not sound dissimilar enough.
Yes. And I definitely had an easier time making them sound different than I did in Red Queen. Also because all of the characters are sort of in the same place and in the same age group. So that was, you know, they already had things that were underlying uniting them. So for a reader, that's not going to read as different on the page. The other thing is making sure all of the POVs are as interesting as the next one, because I never want a reader to open the chapter and see whose chapter it is and be like, damn it.
I know.
I got to suffer through 15 pages of this to get back to the cool stuff, because there are definitely moments in like Song of Ice and Fire where I would open the page and see it was so-and-so's chapter, and but then I also love those moments when you get a character you didn't think you were going to get the POV of, and you're like, oh crap, we're going to go into Cersei's brain now? Oh, she's nuts.
I think you did fantastically, because I was really genuinely invested in all of the characters, and I found all of their journeys equally fascinating. So you did a great job. Right, I'm going to ask you both one more question before I go to the audience, and it's a question that once again is something I'm very interested in, which is how you examine and approach gender in your work. Victoria, I'll start with you, because Realmbreaker is packed with powerful women getting things done. You've got pirates, you've got leaders, you've got assassins, but there is also a slight underlying misogyny, like where I felt like, you know, women like were less was expected of them, or it was said that a woman can kind of pass more unseen or unnoticed. So I just wondered, what was your, like when you set out to write this, what was your approach to gender? Like how were you going to deal with it?
Yeah, I went into this world very much thinking I don't have to bring sexism into it, and I don't have to make the world as inherently violent and hostile towards women as our own world and our own history has been. But I was also, with certain characters, running up against the reality of their situations. Would someone say like Erida, who is a queen who is unmarried, and her entire rule is based on dynasty and based on inheritance, obviously there's going to be something there about, oh, maybe a man should be in charge and you are here to give us heirs, and that's your main point, because that's just the reality of the situation. To remove that, at least from her government structure, would have completely changed what it was. But then there's mentions of other governments where they're like, they don't birth their heirs, they choose them. So the leaders are a little less constricted in terms of gender roles. But then you have the more common characters who are not as bound by gender roles as she is, because, you know, birth doesn't matter to them. But you have an assassin who's a woman who says, yeah, I can look like a servant and no one's going to look twice at me because I'm a woman in this kingdom. And she uses it to her advantage. I love that weaponization of toxic masculinity. That was interesting.
Yeah.
I also just wanted to show the spectrum of what a strong female character is, because I feel like there's always been that stereotype that strong female character means she can kick your butt, which I love to see, but there's more than that.
Absolutely. There was definitely, I felt like there was a massive dichotomy between like the Katniss type character, and then that resulted in the more Bella type characters. You know, obviously I'm not saying that Bella Swan is completely immune to criticism as a character, but I felt like very kind of more feminine characters were derided for quite a long time, if that makes sense. Like, oh, she wants to get married and have kids, so she's a weak female character. But I've literally written essays on that, so I better quickly move on before I go too deep.
Stark versus Arya Stark.
Exactly. That's the exact dichotomy.
Go after one more than the other.
And Kester, I will finish with asking you about the sort of the feminism in yours, because I found that so just brilliantly empowering to read this version of Les Mis, where it's just about a girl trying to save both her sisters. And something I loved, like I said, is that you removed irritating Marius from the situation, and you made the bond between Cosette and Eponine like the heart of this, and I love that so much. And you also gender bent Inspector Javert as well. So did you set out specifically to write, like you said earlier, didn't you, set out to write a more feminist version of the story, right?
Well, I don't think I set out. I think as I walked out of the cinema and everything collided, we are such a product of the things we've seen and things we've consumed in our lifetime, but at the same time we're also the product of the frustration that comes from that, from you guys going like, what, Arwen, you know, and me saying, why couldn't Aragorn marry Éowyn? Sorry, in the book doesn't make any sense. But you know, so there was that element of it as well. I think it was just the natural way the story came out. I never thought about making it feminist, but when you kind of look back and say, how did it happen? It's like sitting down with a psychologist. You can kind of see it. My sister believes the whole book is about me and her, because I've always had a thing about, I have a little sister and I have a thing about protecting her. So when she finished the book, she's like, oh, you wrote a book about your weird issues with me. And I was like, oh, you know, she's nothing like Cosette, but there was that. And some of my favorite characters of all time are I can't believe Sir Samuel Vimes from Terry Pratchett's Discworld, and Batman, and they are in very different, they're actually the same. If you look at their psychological profile, it's actually scary how similar they are in their traumas and how their trauma has shaped who they are. Now I'm a girl and I've grown up, these are the heroes that I cling to the most, that I'm most interested about reading, but I'm not a guy. So when that story projected in my mind, and I've always thought that Eponine had such a rough deal, it just automatically kind of flipped it around, and I put Eponine in that same kind of Batman Sam Vimes mold, where they're so influenced by what they believe is their responsibility to the society, the people in the city that is basically falling around and corrupt all around them. They're obsessed, it's their obsession, you know. And Nina and Etty actually, in the first draft, I had trouble removing Marius and all of the rest, because I was just so stuck with this, how the story goes. Yeah. And no one liked Etty when they read it, because she was really annoying, because I was obviously having trouble separating her, from the original Cosette, who is very annoying. She's not, she just has no character, you know. And then finally I said to my editor, I hate Marius. I wish every scene that Marius is in, I could just put Enjolras, whose name is Saint-Just in the book, in instead. She said, that's a brilliant idea. Why do you need Marius? And taking Marius out liberated me, because then you can take out the love triangle. And if there's no love triangle, and there was the other things that when I read Hugo's book as a child, I read, it's like massive, they call it a brick. I read that and I must have been about 11 or something, because I was a very precocious reader. There's these two young girls, and they're not even teenagers. They live under the roof. One is adopted into the family of a man who is a violent alcoholic. He's physically abusive. He's a criminal. He beats them unconscious. I mean, there's all of these things. And they live in this household, and they see him attack their mother figure and do all this stuff. And they are together for a long time, and then suddenly one disappears and is sold to a stranger. And when they meet all these years later, Eponine looks at Cosette and says, oh, I used to know her once. And I'm like, that's not how girls are. Like, that's not, I'm sorry.
So it's like all that traumatic bonding they went through. It's like, oh yeah, I just knew her one time.
Yeah, she's in love with that guy. Like, I'm like, that's, you might hate each other. You might be eaten up with jealousy, but you'd have more of a reaction than Hugo ever wrote. And that for me made no sense. And the more I thought about it, I was like, you know, even if I hated Cosette, if I was Eponine and I hated Cosette, if a stranger had bought her and I lived in the era she lived in, I would assume the worst, and I would be full of guilt, even if I disliked her, and wondering where she went because she's so young and vulnerable, unlike me who's grown up in this criminal. I'd be haunted by that. And that's how Nina appeared to me. She was hanging off, there was this, I saw her in my mind, and it's not the way I write at all. I don't visualize things, but I saw her hanging off the side of a building in the rain, exhausted, where she had spent years every night after doing all her thieving and stuff, checking every house in the whole city, trying to find this adopted sister that had been sold into essentially what she would have believed was sexual slavery to some random stranger when she was a child, you know, and that she would never have been able to let go of the horror of that, even if they were the worst enemies in the world. And now when you look at it, like forensically, you can say, oh, I see how you would write that, but at the time it just kind of just happened. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. Like when I realized what you were doing with it, I just felt this sense of just so much joy that it was just such a brilliantly effective feminist retelling of it. So thank you very much for doing that, because it just completely changed Les Mis for me. I can now imagine when I see Marius, I'm just going to be like, I'm just going to remember Kester's version where he's just not in it at all.
He doesn't exist.
I hate him. Okay, I could ask you both questions all day, but I'm going to take some audience questions now. There's one from Emma Holbrook. This question is for all of you. Was there a scene within your books that made you get quite emotional, and why? So Victoria, was there a scene in Realmbreaker that really drew emotion out of you? Are you a very emotional writer? Like, do you get sad at the deaths, for example? No?
No, I know some people will cry, and I don't do that. And I wonder if there's something wrong. And I didn't do it during Red Queen either. I don't get terribly emotional. I get really excited. I get very animated. I am, you know, punching in my seat, but no, I'm not on the weepy side of things.
How about you, Kester? Because obviously, like we've discussed, you've been writing about some very intense issues like human trafficking. So do you feel, you know, do you get that real emotional attachment to the characters? Do you get weepy or angry with your characters?
I'm not sure if I get angry with them. I won't actually have a proper sob, but I believe there was 2 times in Court of Miracles, and obviously the sequel's even worse, because as you all know, as the series goes on, you can do worse and worse things to your characters. But but I remember, I think sometimes, because that's the good thing about first person, I suppose, it's not all bad. Nina is so intensely feeling the emotions of perhaps losing, I'm trying not to give spoilers, like perhaps, you know, maybe losing someone, and it's happening to her. So as I'm in her skin and writing it, I might get like tears in my eyes, but I won't go and properly have a sob. I did in book 2 though. I did. It was very sad. I was like, it was so sad. And then I just crack on. It's like a momentary, it's weird. It's like there's something wrong with us as writers, you know, like if a normal person experiences that, they're like, this is really hard. Okay, what am I going to eat now? And I'm totally like, yeah, whatever. It's just very strange.
I have that. I have, what am I going to eat now? That's my response.
Yeah, it's weird because we're essentially carrying a fictional character's emotions on top of our own. So you do kind of have to be able to switch off at some point and go back to your own life. This is an interesting question. If you had to write a book outside of your usual genre, what genre would it be and why? So Victoria, would you consider writing outside fantasy?
I think historical fiction would be the one I would gravitate towards most, but I'm also super intimidated by the amount of research that would be required, but also that my brain would require to feel comfortable writing.
What about you, Kester?
Oh, Regency Romances, 100%. I love me some Georgette Hare, guys. Like, it's ridiculous. But I love to read Regency Romances. I said the spicy ones are okay, but it's the older ones that I feel, it's nothing wrong with the spice levels, but just the story and the characters tend to be so much stronger, you know. And I actually I have this thing where I read it and they're like popcorn. You just read them in like a few hours and then I need more. It's very bad for my wallet, but I'll read something and I'll be like, oh no, if I was writing that scene, here's how I would write it. And then I suddenly I make up a whole book, which has nothing to do with the book that I just read. And I've got them. I've got the whole outlines. I've got like chapters and everything. But I just the research, and not just the research, like Regency Romance readers, they're really nice and also really scarily mean when it comes to getting things right. So
really?
Honestly, the thing I keep thinking is that I've got to find another Regency author. Oh, no, you don't even understand. They'll be like, this is not historically correct. Okay,
These
you should rewrite your book. No.
Wow, that is intense. Because Alwyn Hamilton got me a Regency romance recently. I've literally never read them before, so this world is completely unfamiliar to me.
I know, I haven't read
it called?
And I feel like
oh god, I don't know, something to do with a duke. That's probably like a lot of them.
That narrows it down a lot, Sam.
I'm sorry, I don't know anything about this area. Okay.
Yeah, I haven't read any, but I feel like it's a self-preservation, because I know once I do, I'll be really into it and I won't read anything else. So I'm holding myself back from Regency Romances, I think.
Well, I hope you can.
I'm just going to put this out there so that you'll never be able to forget it. Is called what's it called? These Old Shades by Georgette Heyer. And then there's a sequel that follows. You have it will change. It's just there's no words. Okay.
One thing
and I reread them every year. They're so good.
Oh, good. One thing that surprised me, and I didn't know this was a hallmark of the genre until quite recently, is that romance novels must have a happily ever after. They must have a happy ending. And that is incredible to me, to think that the genre requires that, because we think of what our genres require and what an audience wants, and you sometimes do to them and sometimes you don't, but it's literally not going to be considered a romance novel if they don't end up together. And I found that fascinating.
Wow, that is really fascinating. Wow, I'm really interested in this now.
I never read it.
Oh, here's a question. This one's for Kester. I'm really interested in this as well. What inspired you to create the tiger character in the Court of Miracles? Because obviously you've mentioned that there was like elements of Shere Khan, but he was a really interesting character generally. So could you just talk about your inspiration for him?
Well, I have spent probably 2/3 of my life in third world countries. And the issue of human trafficking is, look, I don't know. When I lived in London, it wasn't something that was on my radar at all. It was as if it was something that didn't really exist. You would see homeless people on the streets, but you never thought about women being trafficked, and yet they are in London around you. Whereas growing up in Mauritius and in the Congo, I've done a lot of social work, and a lot of the uglier sides of life are kind of up in your face. And I think being able to see a lot of those elements from very young, the first time I understood what trafficking was, what sexual slavery was, I was very young and I was completely traumatized. I remember I just sat in the school library and it completely traumatized me as a girl. And I don't think I ever got over it. But it's, as a woman, you know, there's these things you just lock inside and you carry on, because everyone's your classmates carrying on, life apparently goes on, you know. And that was, it really, really deeply marked me. And then of course doing a whole bunch of social work with women in these situations, or from these situations, or the children of the women, or children, there's such a rage. There was a rage in me that could not be, all these years, but there's no way to like let it out. And I didn't plan on doing it. But when Court of Miracles came up, I was saying to myself, okay, so who's going to be Shere Khan? Who is the bad guy? So you've got Etty and Eponine against the bad guy, and it's got to be someone in the criminal guild. So I look at all the guilds, assassins, and I was looking at modern guilds at the time, as in I was looking at modern crime and saying, okay, well, what are the different types of crime? Then I just said, okay, these are the different guilds. And I said, if you're a girl, teenager, who is the man that who's the person you're the most scared of? Is it the assassin? Is it the this? Is it the that? And obviously it was the human trafficker. It just, you know, so I said, okay, so that's the guy they're the most scared of. And then after that, I think I was greatly influenced by watching 12 Years a Slave. And the character of Michael Fassbender is one of my favorite actors. I think he's just mesmerizing. Most people think he's mesmerizing in his acting, but he often plays roles which are not very sympathetic. But in 12 Years a Slave, he was, I mean, it was like a cat. It was like he was literally like a tiger. You couldn't take your eyes off him, and he was completely evil. You know what I mean? But he was so, and for me, his role really hugely influenced. That's who I saw in my head. As soon as I knew it was a human trafficker, it was like Michael Fassbender in that film, and these two things. And in fact, I even describe him as having red hair, which works because he's a tiger and orange stripes and whatever. But actually, that's who I saw in my mind. And I don't know. I think it was a very useful experience to be able to exorcise a lot of my rage about an issue which is prevalent in our society, no matter where we are in the world, and yet is never spoken about, very little discussed, very little comes up about it. And also that feeling of like helplessness, because you are so safe and so privileged. And there is a family literally from where I live, 20-minute walk down the road. And this has happened in their family too, unwillingly. So there's that, it's just, so it was a bit like le cri de coeur, it was like the scream, the cry of my heart against this thing which has been in me since I was little. And it was just one way to just stand there where there's no one there, and just like, it's like this, just, it's so, and I don't want to make it about me, because it's not about me at all. So I also wanted to be able to just put a little spotlight on something. And I think it's, for me, I'm not really into contemporary fiction. I don't enjoy reading it that much. I like to read escapist things. And I just, it was just a way to be able to kind of like put this out on the table. And I'm pretty sure that today's readers are not like, I mean, I was 11, but are not like the readers of 10, 15, 20 years ago. When they read The Court of Miracles, they know somewhere that this is real and this is happening. They're not completely like, you know, oh yeah, such a nice story. Like this is completely make believe. So yeah. I'm sorry, that got really heavy. I don't even know what the question was anymore.
No, that was, no, it was just about the tiger, but no, I think you're completely, when I was reading it, because I remember when I first learned about trafficking, I had that similar, just like, it was almost like a suffocating feeling inside me, like, my God, this is happening, and it's just so prevalent, and like you said, so invisible. And I think that for me, reading it, it felt cathartic, because you could see this fight against, this push back against this awful, hideous thing. Like, even if it is in a book, it was still a really cathartic experience for me. So I can see how that would have been for writing it as well. And also thank you for that answer. I thought it was very detailed and great. Victoria, there's one question for you here that I was going to ask actually, which was about which protagonist was your favorite to write. Was it Coraine? Because she feels like the protagonist to me.
Yeah, Coraine is definitely the main character, and definitely the perspective I put the most of myself in and the most of what I wish I was in. So absolutely, she's the one I find easiest to write and the one I enjoy. I also really enjoy Sarasa, and that's going to be no surprise, because she's a lot of id, and she's very much almost the Greek chorus on a lot of fantasy tropes. She points out a lot of the futility of being noble and being heroic, and her moral compass is completely skewed, and she's a survivor to her bones. So you get to have this moment of, well, if you would just kill this person, it would solve a lot of our problems. And that came to me from the whole idea of, in The Lord of the Rings, when the Mirkwood elves capture Gollum. If they had just killed him, a lot of things wouldn't have happened. And that's the whole, like, well, it's not for us to decide who lives and dies and blah, blah, blah. But in the real world, sometimes it is. And I liked having a person who was on that side of the fence, on the quote hero team.
Yes, I liked her amazing banter with Dom as well. That was great fun to read about.
We had a lot of fun with them, and they hate each other, but it's really good to have two people who really dislike each other who have the same goal.
Yeah, it was a really electric relationship. I loved it. It is now 4 minutes past the hour, so I'm going to have to wrap this up. But it has been such a privilege and a pleasure to talk to both of you. And I could have done this for several more hours, just picking your brains about these two phenomenal books. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us. And please go out and buy The Court of Miracles and Realmbreaker, because they are brilliant and you're going to love them.
Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this, Sam. This was incredible.
Yes, thanks so much for having us both. It was fantastic.
My absolute pleasure. Okay, good night, everyone, and have a great rest of the week.